Good afternoon. I'm Spot On Weather Meteorologist Matthew Euler, and today we're going to talk about in our lesson the polar vortex, the system that makes us shiver. And I want to take a look at different winter atmospheric variables that play a huge role in our weather here in Southeast Virginia, and this is one of them. We had a major implications to the polar vortex back in this area in 2014 in January. And we're going to go ahead and delve right into it. All right, so first, the source of this definition of the polar vortex is from NOAA. So I'm very happy to say thank you, NOAA, for the information. But we're going to go right into the definition of the polar vortex: an area of low pressure and cold air surrounding both of the Earth's poles. It always exists near the poles, weakening in summer and strengthening in the wintertime. And the vortex portion of this refers to the counterclockwise flow of air around it. Okay, so that's the definition of the polar vortex. It's a popular term whenever it gets really cold these days in the wintertime. We hear it a lot in the media. So I just want to introduce you to the definition of it first of all. So generally, what are we looking for when we're looking at weather charts to identify the polar vortex? What kind of weather pattern sets up for this thing? Okay, we have generally a huge displacement, a dislodging of colder air from central Canada, an abnormally displaced area of cold air that dives into the United States. Mainly the eastern United States, is the Midwest and the East is where it impacts the most when the polar vortex is displaced. In this case, the polar vortex is located right over south central Canada, and these different colors indicate colder air. These purple colors and the magenta colors. This is the coldest air. And I want you to notice the connection of this deepening trough, which goes all the way up into the Arctic areas. So the air that should normally be confined to remain over the poles is dislodged southeast, all the way from the Arctic down into the eastern United States. Here's an example of a 500 millibar chart, a chart at 18,000 feet. This is the location of the polar vortex corresponding with this coldest temperature area here on this particular chart. The flow of air, you notice here also we have this huge ridge that sets up, this ridge of higher heights over the western Canada. And that's what we're watching out for this December right now with the pattern. We haven't seen the huge ridge bump up like this, but this is a textbook signature in the weather charts at the 500 millibar level, 18,000 feet. The polar vortex sits here, and you have this huge ridge, which then helps amplify the jet stream pattern and cause a trough, a deep anomalous trough to develop over central United States, eventually shifting into the eastern United States. So the overall weather pattern for the polar vortex to strike is an unusually deep trough of low pressure over east central Canada, dipping into the eastern United States with the center of the polar vortex north of the Great Lakes in this area. And this funnels in exceptionally cold weather. And again, I wanted to point out, look how far north this air mass is. Basically, this trough is tapping into the type of air mass all the way up to the polar areas, all the way down southeast towards the eastern United States and ultimately over towards southeastern Virginia. Now, what's the importance of the polar vortex? Okay. The main one I want to get at here is the changes in the storm tracks, especially the changes in the planetary waves, the long wave pattern in the jet stream. This sets up this anomalous deep trough over the eastern United States. The polar vortex when it weakens. When it weakens is when you get the coldest air dislodged towards the lower 48. There's a lot of other things here on this chart involving the polar vortex, other factors that weigh into it. For example, the northern hemisphere mid-latitude weather obviously is impacted by the changes in the jet stream, the amplification, the Arctic amplification, where the coldest temperatures are actually not in the Arctic area, but they're actually dislodged at more southern latitudes away from the Arctic, usually in the mid-latitudes. Other natural variabilities are associated directly to the polar vortex, including internal climate modes, the solar cycle, volcanic eruptions. And again, Dr. Judah Cohen on the Atmospheric Environmental Research site, AER, Google that, AER, Arctic Oscillation. Dr. Judah Cohen has some great updated blogs weekly. He talks about the polar vortex, its positioning. He basically abbreviates it PV in his discussions. And Dr. Judah Cohen has looked at summer and early fall Arctic sea ice loss, the fall Eurasian snow cover, and then the late fall and winter Arctic sea ice loss in determining the winter forecast and how the long wave pattern in the jet stream is going to set up and how the polar vortex is going to play into this. But there's a lot of different variables that are involved with the polar vortex, but the main thing I want you to focus in on is changes in storm tracks, jet stream configurations, and the planetary waves, the long wave or the Rossby waves. So rules of thumb. This was an image from November 2013. This one on the right was an image of January 5th, 2014. So if the polar vortex is weak and moves off the poles, if it's displaced or split, cold air generally moves south into the United States, like this. This is a detached part of the polar vortex in January of 2014, which resulted in this red arrow represents the jet stream configuration, a huge ridge of high pressure into Western Canada. It bumped into a lot of extremely cold air. It brought cross-Siberian, cross-polar flow into the eastern Canada and ultimately into the eastern United States. And that's an example of a displaced polar vortex. Okay, this is a normal configuration of the polar vortex that happened last winter. If the polar vortex is stronger, it contains the coldest air in this type of shape, generally centered over the polar regions, the Arctic areas, and keeps it up there bottled up. So the main things to realize is the strength of the polar vortex is important, the positioning of the polar vortex is important. Again, to repeat, if the polar vortex is weak, it moves off the poles, such as this diagram indicates. If it becomes displaced or split, cold air basically will move readily south into the United States. If the polar vortex is strong and remains over the polar areas, cold air stays confined up there in those areas in the poles with milder conditions generally over the United States. Look at the jet stream represented by the red arrow here, more of a west to east component. So you're going to get more maritime type air that's going to come from the Pacific and go from coast to coast, west to east coast. Vice this configuration with a weak polar vortex and it's detached, you're drawing in much colder air from the north and much meridional jet stream pattern. All right, that wraps up this session of the polar vortex, a lesson on the polar vortex. It was just a quick down and dirty on the polar vortex and what makes us shiver. Right now, the forecast, I'll go over that real briefly. I'll go ahead and pull that up so you can take a look at that. But to tie in with this lesson, let's take a look at the forecast right now for this winter. So far this winter, the polar vortex has been mainly impacting Europe and Asia, detaching, becoming split, with a piece generally over those areas just north of Europe and Eurasian continent, which has been producing very, very exceptionally cold air. There are indications that the vortex will eventually move into eastern Canada this winter and usher in some extremely cold temperatures to the eastern United States. A lot will be dependent on stratospheric warming events, the sudden stratospheric warming events, and the development of a western upper level ridge. So there's a lot of factors that are involved that really make the winter exceptionally colder as compared to others. The polar vortex is just one piece of that. So just keeping an eye on things. Stay here with us at Spot On Weather. We'll keep you updated on the status of the polar vortex. Again, we're just looking at different atmospheric variables that can impact our winter. And today we took a look at the polar vortex and broke it down. Generally what we look at, rules of thumb, as well as the importance of it in changes of storm tracks, jet streams, what kind of weather pattern we typically have associated with the polar vortex, and then there's the definition courtesy of NOAA. All right, stay with us at Spot On Weather. Remember, if we're not spot on, we're not doing it right. Have a great afternoon.